So Ananda Castaño is from Spain. She's the chief editor of the feminist press Labrys Editorial. She's a radical and lesbian feminist and a woman with disabilities and chronic illnesses. She writes non-fiction essays and poetry and has been a feminist activist in Spain since 2019.
Hello, I'm Ananda Castaño, and I'm going to speak about the social construction of sex orientation. This is a short presentation based on a two-part essay I wrote back in 2019 called El mito de la orientación sexual. It had some repercussion among Spanish-speaking feminists, and I hope it can make you have the same kind of reflections and debates it did for us. I'm currently working in expanding this analysis, so many of the things I'm going to speak about today are not in that old essay, but I consider the most important parts are there in case you want to check it later. So, as feminists, and especially as lesbian feminists, we might have encountered other women who, despite calling themselves feminists, claim that they have a natural sexual orientation. In fact, when entering the conversation about trans activism and queer theory, we face the common discourse of sexual orientation being a biological trait, just like the sex one. This discourse usually aims to protect lesbians from the invasion of trans-identified males, but that doesn't make sexual orientation a real thing, and it doesn't necessarily help lesbians in the long run. Sexual orientation is but the new way in which patriarchy tries to control women's sexuality and relationships. The ways to keep women bound to men have changed over the centuries, and as women gained independency and found ways to avoid the intimate relationships with their oppressors, the patriarchal system needed to refine its narratives in order to maintain social control over women's sexual behavior. Sheila Jeffries has in fact drawn a genealogy of this patriarchal backlash in many of her works, but still lesbians nowadays struggle to acknowledge this genealogy. And when facing it, they can't seem to understand how a feminist social constructionist approach to sexuality could change their acquired views about their supposedly fixed sexual attraction, their so-called sexual orientation. Before the current conceptualization of sexual orientation came around, the patriarchy created many other concepts and narratives to try to control sexual behavior and the understanding of sexuality. In this slide, I've included some models of what some people would call homosexuality, which have preceded the current model of sexual orientation in the West. The original sexologist approach to homosexuality made it clear that it was based on a patriarchal idea which sought social control over sexual conduct and pathologized behaviors that didn't play in pathologized behaviors that didn't play in patriarchy's favor. This idea of homosexuality as a pathology, which in reality was implying heterosexuality was the healthy disposition, was left behind, mainly thanks to lesbian and gay liberation movement, to the lesbian and gay liberation movement. After that came what Celia Kissinger called a humanist liberal model, which saw being gay or lesbian as a lifestyle choice with no political motivation or repercussion. Even though it tries to depoliticize lesbian and gay existence, it implicitly sought to make both fit in the straight model of society, asserting they posed no threat to it. We now find ourselves with a new model of homosexuality, which is not pathologized but is still essentialized, thus splitting women between the naturally heterosexual and the others. A model in which lesbianism is not seen as detrimental but is theorized as a way that makes it an individual thing with no political basis or repercussion. Excuse my reading. This is the model of sexual orientation, which also includes the heterosexual and bisexual orientations. We could speak of how this model of sexual orientation is now being used by other groups that were once considered sexually different such as pedophiles or zoophiles, to legitimize their practices. But we'll have to leave that issue for some other occasion. Some other occasion. We'll talk about it. We have just seen some of the characteristics of the model of sexual orientation. Now let's observe its contents. What is sexual orientation? First of all, it is a theoretical concept, meaning this is not a proven fact or universally accepted notion, but only a theory that has gained popularity, despite little evidence to support it. The term has been around for a while, but it began to be used in the way it is now by the late 80s. It is based on the concept of attraction, which is itself a vague term and a construction, and I'll explain this in a moment. And last but not least, it conveys an immutable and or fixed quality, an immutable or fixed quality. This is a new discourse created because the innate disposition has no evidence. Sexual orientation is conceived as a trait that changes regardless of when it is fixed in the person. Some could say it is fixed in the womb, depending on the position of testosterone. Some allege to observe it later and speak of environmental factors along with the biological factors. And some others keep trying to prove it is genetic, with no luck. This is the American Psychological Association definition of sexual orientation, in case you didn't know it. Scientists have tried to prove homosexuality is a biological trait for more than a century, but the evidence tells otherwise. The truth is no genetic factors have been found. There's no organic difference between two people of the same sex when one is labeled as homosexual and the other is labeled as heterosexual. Scientists might try to establish some difference in brain or hormonal dispositions, but by doing so, they are reversing causality and ignoring the prominent fact of brain plasticity. Scientists would need to find a predictive factor for homosexuality or heterosexuality in order to prove this being natural, but such thing has never been found. You might find a lot of papers trying to prove this biological basis, but most of them have awful design flaws. A lot of them use conflating science, which includes its own social constructs and selection bias. Others use empirically checkable traits, but interpret the results using the social constructs that weren't present in the research model. Those are only two of the most common methodological flaws, but I won't spend much time on this since we still have a lot to talk about. As we said before, the most widespread definition of sexual orientation is grounded in the concept of sexual attraction. But attraction itself seems to refer to a pattern or at least to an inferred principle and not to anything checkable by itself. Attraction is a construction based on recurrent sexual desire. Note how sexual is also a constructed concept. And desire itself is just an interpretation of arousal. Desire can be acknowledged as such, or it can be totally ignored, not perceived as a desire. It is clear that sexual desire or arousal It is clear that the sexual desire or the arousal that an object we interact with makes us feel is something real and experiential. However, the evidence it provides doesn't prove all the things that the concept of sexual orientation implies, since the phenomenon of arousal isn't something fixed or immutable. It is only a phenomenon, with its spatial and temporal limitations, and nothing makes us think that the fact it occurred implies that it should have occurred, and that it will always occur in the same way. Sorry, I got a message in my computer. So, what is this? Yeah. millennial PowerPoint. To sum it up, the notion of sexual orientation is inferred from the fact of arousal, or its subjective interpretation, which is desire. It is a totally arbitrary operation. Psychologists and sexologists assert that if they can see a pattern where a person supposedly only feels desire towards people of one sex or another, or even both, then there must be something in them that makes this happen, something that is conditioning this supposed pattern. This is an induction fallacy, and it is in no way scientific, but it is really useful for patriarchy. We cannot establish a law for a pattern of occurrence. This is an empirical principle, meaning that if a sequence of occurrence shows a pattern, it doesn't mean it will always show the same pattern. But the concept of sexual orientation goes a step forward, trying to claim that what makes the supposedly immutable pattern occur is a biological element, another false syllogism. From the supposed existence of a pattern of desire, we cannot infer there's something natural, organic, or in any other kind, which causes the pattern by modulating such desire. Sexual orientation uses yet another fallacy, which is key to its role in the patriarchal system. It establishes a generalization towards people who share the sex characteristic of anyone we have acknowledged as object of our desire. So I think you can see how this would be a fallacy. A concept which relies on so many fallacies shouldn't be taken seriously by many. Sorry again. I'm going too fast, I think. But it seems to be embraced by a majority of our society. Why is this? Sexual orientation also relays in patriarchal narratives and institutions. The institution of heterosexuality is the main one. It conditions women's desires from our childhood. So we are interested and focused in liking boys and men. It tries to make us unable to conceive women as objects of our sexual desire, which is reserved to men. Even if we experience sexual arousal when in relationships with another woman, we'll find it difficult to relate it to sexual desire. On the other hand, we'll tend to interpret any kind of pleasant feelings we experience with men as a sign of desire towards them. The patriarchy will also offer ostensible rewards in the form of socially approved lifestyles, which we can only enter through relationships with men and in reality only serve to men's interests. Because of this, we'll have many instances of what we interpreted as desire towards men, not only sexual. We'll only pay attention to those desires and disregard any feelings towards women as sexual, and will fear being anything other than heterosexual and ignore situations in our life that could make us question our mutual desires. According to the sex orientation narrative, there will seem to be a pattern of desire entirely composed of desire towards men, so we will think we are heterosexual. But of course, not everyone who believes in sexual orientation thinks of themselves as heterosexual. The institution of heterosexuality doesn't have total control over the lives of women. Conditioning is not perfect. Social norms don't mold the totality of human experience. We don't comply with gender roles, for example. Arousal around women does occur, and we can still interpret it as sexual desire. All kinds of desire towards women also happen, and this makes us want to establish relationships that the patriarchy forbids and doesn't conceive with women. It is possible to have only felt arousal or other feelings that make us understand ourselves as lesbians with other women, but it doesn't make it a biologically conditioned phenomenon. Remember, a pattern doesn't imply a law. But most women have in fact been groomed by the institution of heterosexuality and have thought they had feelings and sexual desires towards men before calling themselves lesbians. Some others did have those feelings and desires and even had sexual relationships with men and male partners which they enjoyed back then, even though later they saw them as insignificant and not worth of their energy or attention once they became lesbians. If we use the sexual orientation perspective, we cannot accept the possibility of a change in the pattern since sexual orientation is supposedly fixed. The sexual orientation model would in most cases try to convince these women that they were not conditioned into trying to like males before they even knew what that meant. It would either use a sort of psychoanalytical approach to make us look into our past and only recognize the true as true. Sorry, I'll start again. It will either use a sort of psychoanalytical approach to make us look into our past and only recognize as true our desire towards the people of the sex we think marks our sexual orientation, which can be seen as a confirmation bias, or it could say the pattern always included both sexes, which thus conceive most women who start desiring women after being exposed to compulsory heterosexuality as bisexuals. Bisexuality is a cornerstone of the sexual orientation theory. It acts as a safety net for all the possible exceptions. When mutability in desire or arousal is evident, bisexuality is conjured. The supposed element that conditions desire will still be present, but it could act directing desire towards both sexes. This way, the sexual orientation theory would seem foolproof, thus validating the way in which most people think they are naturally heterosexual and can never be another thing. When used along with the psychoanalytic confirmation bias that seek to claim that all our desires and arousals were always the same, the bisexuality stance makes the theory of sexual orientation unfalsifiable. Unfalsifiable. I hope most of you know that word. It doesn't. It means that it doesn't contain in its conception a way to prove it false. Despite this could make some see the theory as convincing, this is in fact a common criterion for regarding a theory as unscientific. Um, there might still be some lesbians who, after listening to this talk, keep thinking they are biologically different from the rest of women who have experienced some kind of desire towards men or have not experienced it in the same way they did. Some lesbians are afraid of the possibility of desire being something that can be intervened. They talk of conversion therapy as if lesbian feminists had the power over other women to try and forcefully condition their desire or limit their experience, as sexologists have done in the past. Others say they'd rather not be lesbians. They tell us they have suffered loss because of this and think it would have been better for them if patriarchal conditioning would have actually worked. But it not working for them doesn't mean it was because something biological prevented it. They also say they tried not to desire women and failed. which could easily be explained because stopping to appreciate women the way we already do, being ourselves women, goes against basic self-esteem and is really alienating. I'd say what has kept these women having recurring moments of desire towards other women and focusing on those moments as the meaningful ones is how freeing relationships with other women are. The rewards, even if they were not socially appreciated, and we can hardly name them, are much more significant than the punishment. Some mothers are afraid of the possibility of their desire changing. This is a fact. This is in fact an anxiety that is provoked by the sexual orientation narrative. In this model, that change would mean a questioning of one's sexuality and identity. However, from a feminist viewpoint, a change in desire could have many explanations, one being the constant bombing of patriarchal propaganda, and it could be regarded as not having any kind of power over ourselves. This way, we can look for ways to overcome it if we feel that it's harmful. This seems to be an obvious approach when the desire is towards sadomasochism or anything learned from pornography exposure or other patriarchal conditioning. So it makes no sense. We can see it in the same way when it happens towards men. You don't have to believe in sexual orientation to be a lesbian. The idea of being a lesbian doesn't require the sexual orientation concept. In fact, the concept of lesbian is much older. We might consider ourselves lesbians because we do in fact have feelings and relationships with women that go way beyond arousal. Sexologists have tried to reduce lesbian existence to a sexual desire practice. Doesn't erase really. Sorry. I'll start again. Sexologists have tried to reduce lesbian existence to a sexual desire for practice. This doesn't just erase really important parts of our lives, but also functions to depoliticize what being a lesbian means and to try to regain control over us by the creation of new prescriptive sexual narratives and practice for lesbians. We as lesbians also decide to keep embracing those feelings and relationships which in fact don't oppress us or alienate us, in which we feel free. This is an important distinction between understanding ourselves as lesbian from a feminist perspective and doing it from a sexual orientation perspective. Sexual orientation seeks to conceal, sorry, seeks to conceal our agency over sexuality and the ability to reclaim our power over our own sexuality is key for any radical feminist. Sexual orientation, there is our agency, and lesbian feminists raise consciousness about it. Summarized talk based on an old essay, some old essays, and my current research on the topic, which I hope I will publish soon. If you are interested in any of this, feel free to contact me through my any platform or my email.